we do have to start to think too about what types of technology are we going to leverage in building new homes.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I am Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we are bringing you the smart conversations with people in the know that you won't hear anywhere else.
We are taking you to Motor City this week, and we're really excited to talk about some of the things happening in Detroit and elsewhere. But I want to start with a couple of interesting facts. So you may not know, but half of Detroit's residents are actually renters, and their median household income is only $27,000. That's $13,000 lower than Michigan's median income. And in the past 2 decades, too, on the home ownership side, Detroit has experienced one of the highest tax foreclosure rates in the entire country. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone. Detroit has suffered a lot since the collapse of the automobile industry and manufacturing there. But sometimes when you hear stats like that, it's really pretty profound how tough things are right now in Detroit, but getting better.
Yeah, John, when we think about actionable ideas and having to put practical housing solutions in play, that is exactly what we're talking about in Detroit and what we're talking about with Laura here today. So I'm really excited as a fellow Motor City resident, as a Detroiter, that our guest, Laura Grannemann, has played a huge role in helping Detroit understand housing and address housing needs across the entire spectrum, John, that you just mentioned that we're going to talk about. Also in Detroit, it's the biggest small town, and so we are neighbors. And so I'm excited to have a fellow Detroiter and a neighbor on Housing Insiders today.
I am super excited to have Laura as well. Laura and I have met a couple times in the past, and I've always been impressed at anytime you get to see her speak. She's incredible on stage, and she's just really brilliant. Just to give you a quick background on Laura, she is the executive director of the Gilbert Family Foundation, which is sort of the philanthropic arm of Dan Gilbert's Rock portfolio of companies. She also, at the same time, as if that's not enough to do, runs the Rocket Community Fund, which is the foundation and fund. They have an arsenal of money and expertise that they've committed to things like housing stability, neighborhood equity, and addressing all the challenges that I just mentioned in Detroit. And honestly, the results have been really profound. Laura, amazing background. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So Laura, one of the things that we wanted to talk about as we think about the work that you've done, what John mentioned, you have to think at this really strategic level of public company, a billionaire's family fund, and a billionaire who fortunately cares deeply about his hometown. But you also then have to put things in play that I would say are ground level, street level, dirt level. So the framing I had been thinking about to ask you just to start is, how did you come to create a strategy that is clouds and dirt, at the same time? How did you approach that work, and where are we today?
I have always been really impressed and inspired by the way that Dan Gilbert has approached the work that he's done in the city of Detroit. And so I just am happy to be building upon that foundation. I think what he views is this opportunity for our business to play a more comprehensive role in community development in the city of Detroit. He likes to frame it as being a for more than profit organization. So not just a for-profit, not just a not-for-profit, but this sort of more complicated recognition of the fact that our business and our community are inextricably linked and we should treat it as such. And so as a part of that sort of philosophy, I really love thinking about every tool in our toolkit, whether it is philanthropic capital or on the business side, whether it's technology or our team members or our ability to advocate for policy change. And so really thinking about like all the levers that we have to pull collectively and which levers are appropriate in which situations. In many cases, we have to start with, and in every case, I would say, we talk a lot about falling in love with the problem, not the solution. And philanthropy is like so often the place where people go with a clear solution. If I only have $100,000 for this thing, we could do X, Y, and Z, right? But that can't be the place that we start. We have to start by falling in love with the problem. And that for us looks like looking at how people are navigating the systems, how people are experiencing the problems that that show up in their day-to-day life. And so we start by really deeply getting to know the experience of the people that we serve, and then try to fit the systems and solutions to where they are. And I'd say that's how we sort of pair the needs with the tools that we have.
It's amazing. And you guys do so much, and you cover so many different types of problems, and ultimately the solutions that scope out to address that. So can you, maybe just to help us frame up how to think about this conversation, can you give us like the landscape of where you see the major issues in Detroit, or the major issues that you are hoping to address, either from the Dan Gilbert Family Foundation side or RCF? Like, give us the lay of the land in terms of where you see what problems have you fallen in love with, I should say.
First of all, like, my opinion is that you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And so while there are a lot of challenges to address in the city of Detroit and beyond, we've tried to stay really focused on the ones that we feel we have the tools to be able to address most productively and actively. And that really starts with a foundation of housing. And we're on Housing Insiders, which, by the way, longtime listener, first time caller, I'm very excited to be here. So, I figure that the best place to start is talking more about the housing needs in the city of Detroit. And we say a lot, so goes Detroit, so goes the nation. So there's a really deep connectivity between the experiences that are happening in the city of Detroit and certainly other post-industrial Midwestern cities. But I think even beyond post-industrial Midwestern cities, there's a lot of lessons to learn in the experience of the city of Detroit and the way that our housing stock looks today. So we believe that everyone should be well housed, just like you guys. And we definitely believe that the foundation of housing is the foundation for success in every other part of a person's life. So that is really where we start. We focus on folks who are at risk of displacement, either through tax foreclosure or eviction, and try to intervene in that displacement so that that does not happen. And then build on stability from there. So offering additional resources like home repair, escrow for additional long-term home repair, estate planning and probate, things like that, that help people be able to maintain their home in a healthy and safe way.
So can we get practical around what you heard from Detroit residents? I'm thinking of this imagery of how goes Detroit, so goes the country, and vice versa. Was this an aging housing stock problem? Was this a tax foreclosure because of family? You mentioned probate, family situation. Was it all of the above? Can you talk a little bit about talking to families in Detroit, what you heard, and what were the major contributing factors to what led them to be in the position they were in?
Well, I think it's a macro and a micro trend challenge. In the city of Detroit in particular, there's a really long standing challenge of population decline that has tremendously affected the way that people experience their macro environment and also their individual housing situation. Because people left the city in such significant numbers from roughly 1950 until today, almost. Last year, we gained like 2,500 people in population. And that was the first time we had a population growth in decades. So we're thrilled with that start, but we've got a long way to go. Because of that significant population decline, we have had some serious ramifications, right? Our city was built for 2 million people. Over time, if that many people are leaving, you don't have to provide services for 2 million people, but you still have to provide services that span the same geography, right? So we have a 140 roughly square mile city that we still have to collect garbage and pick up, collect trash, snow removal, lights, hospitals, all the things still have to work. And that has caused over time fewer and fewer people paying into the property tax base, therefore a higher and higher property tax rate. As the property tax rate has increased, now we have one of the highest, if not, I would say the highest major municipality property tax rate in the country. That also acts as a deterrent to start to attract other people into the city. And you get this vicious cycle of fewer people, higher property tax rate, attracting fewer people, the services get worse. And so you start to see this downward spiral. I think that we have done a really good job of starting to stabilize that, but our property tax rate is still detrimentally high. And it has really impacted the way that people can access financing, the way that people can, just be able to sort of safely stay in their homes. So we had at one point roughly 15,000 people a year who were experiencing property tax foreclosure. And that was a huge immediate concern for those individuals. Many of them were actually eligible for property tax exemptions because of their income. And so we first started by reaching them with that property tax exemption to just try to keep them in their home. And then as soon as you help someone with their property tax situation, they say, this is great, but now I'm right. I was saving all my money for this property tax payment that I was trying to make. And therefore, I didn't pay for the new roof that I needed, or my porch
Mm-hmm.
is falling down. I couldn't maintain the house that I was in. So now this aging housing stock sort of continues to creep up. And so, anyway, it's a yes, and all the things that you said right at the beginning, like all of these factors, aging housing stock, population decline, property tax rate, they all fit together in this really complicated way.
Well, and also this idea of I could make it work at one time, and then all these things layered on top or put downward pressure on me as prices increase, as taxes increase. I can no longer make it work, even though I could. And that could be a fixed income issue, that could be a family issue. But I was making it work. Now I can't make it work anymore. I mean, that is a Detroit story. That's a very American story as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I do think, right, housing stability is the place that we start because we believe that people need to have a stable home in order to be successful elsewhere. But Detroit has both an affordable housing problem and an income problem. In order to get to a place of stability for our residents, we also have to be focused on helping Detroiters grow their income. That's an important part of this equation.
I mean, you laid out a macroeconomic trend that's been studied, pretty extensively, and I'm going to mention a couple books to make myself sound smart. But like, there's a book called, "Smaller Cities in a Shrinking World," which is sort of an international study of like what happens when industries go away and cities start to shrink, and what can be done. There's like lots of books on sort of like new geography of jobs, like as new jobs replace old types of jobs, as finance and tech replace manufacturing, that sort of relocates all the sort of high wealth producing jobs, leaving certain cities with, unless they're able to attract that kind of work, it leaves them with sort of meds and eds, as they say, just, hospitals and schools. And that's all you sort of have for like higher income. So you're just like paying to educate and keep each other alive, but not really generating more productivity. And it's a really, really, it's such a profound challenge. And I want to get into the sort of very micro level type of work that you do to address, I think, the symptoms of that longer term trend. But I also, part of the reason I want to ask this question too is because Dan Gilbert is one of these kind of crazy visionaries who thinks he's going to turn around the city of Detroit, not just like save it as it's dying, but like literally reinvigorate it. To your point, solving the income problem. And how do you think about that? Like, is there hope that Detroit can kind of start seeing real population growth, start attracting businesses and higher income, higher paying jobs so that it can spur a lot more service industries and other things around it? Like, is there a vision for that? Or is it just, we've got to figure out how to maintain and survive for the next 50 years?
Jeremy knows this very well. John, I think you know this too. We have a set of cultural values that we call isms at the family of companies, and one of them, really, to me, is very important in this line of work, and that's you'll see it when you believe it, which is basically saying the cynical I'll believe it when I see it. It does not work in these situations. You need to have a vision. You need to recognize that the systems that we exist within today were all systems that were established by people. And if we're going to get to a better place, we have to first believe that that better place is possible and recognize that we can build a better mousetrap. And so that's kind of where we start, that yes, our vision is not crazy, that we can do this, we can do this together, and that we have to make some big bets to get there. And I think for Dan, that first big bet was, I'm going to move my business, which at the time was like 15,000 people, to downtown Detroit. And it was in the midst of a time when Detroit was just entering bankruptcy. It was not a time when most major business owners would bet on the city of Detroit. But having that job base in downtown Detroit was so incredibly important. So pairing the job creation element, which again goes back to this idea of being a for more than profit organization, just having the jobs in the city of Detroit was a huge, huge, like, I cannot overstate how important those jobs are to the health and vibrancy of the city of Detroit. And then we paired that with public space activations and community investment, and then these housing investments. And so it all has to speak to each other, but you have to start with really tangible, tactical decisions. I think this is a long way of saying the future, we have to believe that a better future is possible. And in order to get there, we have to make some big bets that are then supplemented by the sort of investments that we're making in the community every day.
So it sounds like socializing those big bets is huge. Identifying exactly where they all will fit together is also the complexity of the entire community city structure that you just mentioned. So I guess, what I'm asking is, how do you balance going about it on your own, which is like the most clear, straightforward way to solve a problem is we identify the problem, we'll go and solve the problem. But you also have to bring along all these others to help because of the complexity of all of those other pieces to make housing work and make the city work. What did it take, or are there any examples of where you had to tell a specific story or reframe housing, or you're probably still in the midst of it in all kinds of different ways? What are some of the strategies you used, or that others in other cities could be looking at and saying, this is how we brought everybody to the table, or this is how you can actually create the consensus you need in a complex city?
Yeah, I mean, I think a great example of that is the tax foreclosure crisis in Detroit. As I said, 15,000 people experiencing property tax foreclosure in a single year. And all of those people, for the most part, were viewing that as a personal responsibility issue, right? They were sort of hiding it because they felt shame. Other people looked at that as a personal responsibility failure. And, how can you be a homeowner if you can't afford your property taxes? Right? That's the question that we heard over and over and over again. And then when you take a step back and you look at some of those macroeconomic trends that I was talking about, you start to see how it's not just an individual who can't afford their property taxes. It's a system that over time became unaffordable and unproductive in the city of Detroit. Really, we were pushing people out of the city, maybe for some very short-term financial gain, just to sell the property. There is some revenue from that, but ultimately we're losing more and more and more population because we're pushing people out of their homes. So that's not where we need to start. We need to start with reframing that issue, not as a personal responsibility failure, but as a system failure. And that reframe in and of itself brought people together in a very different way and allowed us to sort of open up the challenge and recognize that there are resources to help people that are going through that challenge. I think that was the beginning of a much more beneficial conversation as a community, to then get to a place of, ultimately, we're now down 95% in the number of property tax foreclosures that happen in the city of Detroit.
That's amazing. Can you, a warning, I'll get teary-eyed at a Hallmark commercial, but the great thing about where you get to sit is you get to sit and talk to the people that are experiencing this. And are there stories that, you've seen or personally interacted with that you find are representative of why it's worth sort of putting the money in this place as a way to sort of address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I would call out is, John, at the beginning, you said 50% or more of our population are renters. I think one of the things that exemplifies to me the opportunity of homeownership is a program that we operate called Make It Home, which is a program that allows renters who are living in properties that are behind on their property taxes to become the owner of those properties. And this was something that we did not know about at all. I personally was surprised by this. We sent people door to door to visit every person, every property that was behind on its property taxes. It was about 65,000 households, and collected some basic information from them. We asked them, how many people live in your household? Roughly, what's your income level? What's your relationship to the property? A couple other questions. And the answers that came back really illuminated for me. That particular year, we had about 52% of the people that we were seeing in this foreclosure system were renters. And so, talk about it's not a personal responsibility failure. It's really not a personal responsibility failure if you're the renter of a property that's behind on their taxes. Many of these renters were paying diligently and were surprised that their home was in foreclosure. And so we worked with the city of Detroit. We were able to say, basically, we want to pay for the back taxes associated with these properties and then offer them first to the renter to be the homeowner. So far, we've been able to support about 1,700 new homeowners in the city of Detroit as a result of this program, which is incredible. But the story that comes to mind for me is a wonderful woman named Pearlie Mack, who had been living and renting this particular property for a decade or more. She was the matriarch of her family. She had 3 daughters and like 8 grandchildren who were all sort of in and out of this property. She was working diligently, paying her rent diligently, and found out that she was going to lose her home to property tax foreclosure. We were able to offer her the property for less than $5,000. And that gave her the jump start that she needed to then be able to have, a solidly safe and stable home for her family, not just her immediate family, but all of these grandchildren who now are in a better place. It allowed her the financial stability because she was able to actually save money as opposed to paying the rent that she was previously paying, which had been increasing. And she was then able to support the dreams and wishes of her children and grandchildren. So just a fantastic story that I think really showcases the power of some of these very small tactical investments when you really meet people where they're at and you understand how the system is impacting their life. Just a small amount of money, in her case less than $5,000, allowed her this opportunity and really opened up and changed not only her world, but her family's.
That's incredible. And then, I mean, first of all, the story is amazing, but 1,700, you said?
1,700 new homeowners. Yeah.
That's like one of the most successful programs I've ever heard of. That's incredible. Wow.
Thank you.
And John, one of the common themes that we hear on programs that are successful is doing that really hard frontline work, going door to door. Like that is a difference maker. And when we hear about programs that are working in places, it's really doing that, doing some very significant frontline on the street work that, eliminates a lot of the speculation and assumptions that you have to make in other kind of policy making areas when you're actually talking to folks.
I would also say, that the work that we do here in Detroit, again, this is another example of where kind of taking a step back, zooming out a little bit. Detroit is, that might sound like a crazy number, like less than $5,000 to be able to own this home. And it is a crazy number because a lot of things had to work together. We really had to line everything up to enable Pearlie Mack to be able to purchase this home for that amount of money. But the city of Detroit, because property values are where they are, it's a more accessible place to be able to own a home. There's just a lot of other services that have to work to be able to to make it a healthy home, right? So we also have to think about home repair. We also have to think about the property tax burden. Whereas a place like New York or San Francisco, you wouldn't dream of ever having land or home ownership for as little as $5,000. I think it's important to have different conversations, one in the Midwest or in the post-industrial cities, and one on the coast. The landscapes are so different, and we should be talking more about the needs of Midwestern cities. Affordable housing just means something different here in the city of Detroit than it does in many other places. But it comes with some different needs, some different expectations, to be able to get people to a place where they're stable and they're healthy.
One of the things I was hoping we could talk about, Laura, is Dan Gilbert. Dan also cares and invests deeply in Cleveland. And so as a result, you look at Cleveland as well. He owns the Cavaliers. There has been real estate development and housing related work in Cleveland. Is there any value in comparing cities? Do you learn from each other as you do work in both cities? And what can we pass on to people about the work that you do that they can then take to their city by learning more about Detroit and Cleveland together, or thinking through, our audience taking it to their city?
Yes, we do some work in Cleveland, in particular in the housing space. And I think one of the key things that I've learned is that we should be talking to each other more. We should be working together more. Cleveland and Detroit have a lot of synergies, but there's not a super deep ongoing conversation happening about how we can learn together. And so that's something that we feel passionately about continuing to grow over time. In fact, we've brought some programs from the city of Detroit to Cleveland to start to replicate them, including that program that helps renters become owners, and our door-to-door outreach to really understand deeply the needs of people living in Cleveland who are at risk of displacement. I think there's a few key themes that I would say that have come out of both. One, a lot of the needs are the same, and this feeds into the like post-industrial city. Home repair is top of the list. Mortgage comparables and the values that we see in neighborhoods, that's top of the list. Making sure people have access to financing, top of the list. And then Wayne County, which is where Detroit is the number one for property tax foreclosure, but Cuyahoga County is number two, which is where Cleveland is. So again, I think a lot of those macroeconomic trends that I was talking about at the beginning, they have played out in a lot of these cities. And in my opinion, we're stronger together. We should be coordinating and communicating to really make sure that our voice and stories in post-industrial cities are being heard at the national level and informing policy to make sure that our residents are getting the resources that they need.
I was thinking about the right time to ask this question. I think it's now, given that the Pistons have the 1 seed and the Cavs are in the playoffs, and you work in both cities, and Dan owns
Oh
the
no.
Cavs. I'm really curious as to where your allegiances fall. And just FYI, I am a
Ugh.
Clevelander originally, and so I know what the right answer is, but I'm curious what yours is.
You know what? I grew up in East Lansing, so my heart is actually with the MSU Spartans, which means I'm gonna pick Cleveland because I've been to so many Cavs games and they're just a wonderful team. So I'm gonna go Cleveland.
I love it. All right. Well, next time they play the Wizards out here, Laura, you have an open invite to come out and watch the Cavs with me. Jeremy and I, you've probably heard us talk about this on Housing Insiders and numerous other places, but what drives me nuts is people are always like, we need to create new cities, like we're going to create this new city in California. And it's just like, new cities are cool, but what about old cities? I'm just use a line that Jeremy will appreciate from an Instagram producer that he shared with me. But anyway, I wonder why it is. And a lot of what I think about, and you've sort of alluded to this numerous times, is just as housing stock ages, it just becomes way less attractive, and then people leave, and then the neighborhood becomes less attractive. The schools are less attractive. The infrastructure is there, but a lot of these neighborhoods need to be sort of completely revitalized in a really more fundamental way. But I'm just curious. I do find Midwestern cities to be like the great hope of our housing supply crisis. Why don't people agree with me? And is it just that we need to replace a lot of houses, and that's really just an insurmountable challenge?
Well, one of the biggest challenges I think in the city of Detroit, as we're thinking about the need for more housing stock, because it's true we need a lot more housing stock, is that the oftentimes the cost of developing the new housing is not the same. It's more than the cost you can sell the property for once that house is built. There's a gap in the development versus the sale price. So the economics are not in our favor in terms of helping people access housing at greater scale. And I think this is true in other post-industrial cities, but it's especially, there's a really deep gap in the city of Detroit. And part of that is the property tax burden that we've already talked about. Part of that is just the fact that our home values are lower, and in many cases because distressed sales or property tax foreclosures have happened around those properties. So it's sort of artificially pulling down values. But we need to create that virtuous cycle in order for those properties to ultimately pencil. And that means starting. So a lot of times our philanthropic dollars are going to fill that gap and set a comparable so that other properties can then value their property based on that comparable. And then we kind of keep going, keep building, right? And that leads to that sort of virtuous cycle. So I do think that that's one of the biggest challenges. And we do have to start to think too about what types of technology are we going to leverage in building new homes. Jeremy and I were talking just the other day, like a lot of the housing stock that we have here in the city of Detroit would not be permitted today. We would not be able to build the same housing. So when you talk about the elegance and beauty of these older Midwestern cities, like I totally agree with you. And also a lot of the houses, the house that I'm in right now probably would not be allowed to be built today. So some of these big questions I think have to be grappled with and answered if we're going to continue to maintain some of our older Midwestern cities. It is just fundamentally easier to just start again in many cases. But I hope we don't do that because there's something really special and
Yeah.
valuable about the work and the people here.
So this idea that and I was looking at this really closely because I got really fascinated with this idea of like, how do we take advantage of infill lots, make it easier to finance, make the process smoother to go put a home on that. And so I was looking at lots in Detroit and then looking at manufactured housing producers that maybe could put a double wide on that lot and adding those numbers up. And to your point, like it's higher than what other homes in the neighborhood are selling for sure. And it's probably higher than what somebody would buy it for. Are you guys engaging in those types of development projects? Are you out there building single family homes? Or I'm just kind of curious as to how actively involved you are in that type of activity.
Yeah, I think we have to be really thoughtful about whenever we're creating a program, we start with what's the problem we're trying to solve. And again, really deeply falling in love with that problem. What I often find in philanthropy is you're trying to solve for too many things at once. And so crafting really thoughtfully, if there's a problem with development penciling with that gap, where is the gap felt the most deeply? In many cases in Detroit, we're seeing it. There's a huge issue with pre development dollars. So we have a lot of vacant land in the city of Detroit, but it's not all ready to go, ready to be developed upon. And so you have to get the underground infrastructure, you have to get the sidewalks, you have to get the alleys, you have to get the utility hookups, everything has to be ready to go. And when that burden falls on the developers, that really creates a sort of downward pressure on the ability for the project to work. So that's one place that we've evaluated investing more deeply. That has nothing to do with potential technology changes in the building process, or very little to do with potential technology changes. But then we've also said, how can we start to catalyze this conversation around what new technology in building could look like? And so we do have a really cool showcase project that has happened in the city of Detroit that we've invested deeply in. It's in North Corktown, where we've got 7 properties now that were all built through either manufactured housing, modular housing, factory built housing. And that's literally the goal there was to showcase that this technology has evolved so much over time that we don't need to be scared of it, and that the neighborhood around it really can be proud of that product. So I think there's a number of ways that philanthropy in particular can play in these types of challenges. We can't do everything. As I said at the beginning, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. So we've got to start with, what is this particular investment trying to address? And those are a couple ways that I think we can kickstart that conversation.
That's great.
One of my favorite quotes that I've heard you say is that 100 years ago, Detroit created the middle class through the auto industry with a job and a house, and that we can do that again through housing. And Detroit has a new mayor. Mayor Mary Sheffield has committed to 1,000 new homes, single-family homes. So a lot of things are coming together. A lot of things are converging. Can you just look ahead? And you don't have a crystal ball. You don't have a magic wand, although sometimes I think you do with the amazing things that you work on. But tell us, what do you think the next few steps are? What happens next to get your work, Rocket's work, the mayor's office, the other stakeholders around the table to really make that a reality and show other American cities what's possible?
I think it's a mix of really big bets and really small tactical steps. I'll give you some specifics. So I think that there needs to be a clearly identified fund and some clear parameters where developers are able to take packaged lots and develop on those lots, knowing that, hey, if you lose some portion of this development, if you lose money on some portion of this development, there's some way to get that money back. There's a fund that's there to support you in that for the first few, right? To then kickstart that market and then be able to build from there. However, I would say that that's the big bet. However, in order to get to that point, there's a lot of process orientation at the city of Detroit level that also needs to be addressed. And so that is bringing people around the table, which we're doing, to be able to say, how do we get a property permitted, the zoning correct, and all the supportive services to get that property built upon all lined up in the right way. Over the, let's see, between 2018 and 2023, there were 44 single family permits pulled in the city of Detroit, which I just think is insane. And the reason that there were only 44 is because all of those processes were not working together, and some of the macroeconomic trends that we've talked about too. But you really have to take a deep look at those processes along the way. So I think it's getting everybody around the table. I think there's got to be a measure of accountability in how to set up the process and how to make it work and how to make sure that we're evaluating it over time. And then separately, there's got to be, it's like carrots and sticks. Then there's got to be this carrot to help people sort of get through that process and make sure that at the end of the day, you're not losing money on a property that you're investing in.
I mean, that's a lot. That's not an easy. That's not an easy list. There's so many different little pieces that you have to think about. I'm curious in terms of your interactions with the rest of the Dan Gilbert world. So obviously, Rocket, all of our listeners will know very well. There's lots of other companies that Dan's involved in. You also have there's a venture fund. How closely do you interact with them, and how do you think about that interplay? I'm just kind of curious to know how do you guys all operate together and what that looks like? Because I think there's a lot of other places where my guess is that it's very positive and that you do interact, and my guess is other places should be doing more of those kind of interactions. But can you kind of maybe give us examples, or how you think about the for-profit and make it for more than profit with what you're doing?
I mean, I think the best example of this is between our philanthropy and Rocket. But we certainly do, we call it tie threads. We tie threads with all of the other businesses as well. You know, if there's an organization that comes into the city of Detroit, a small business that is saying that, you know, they want to get involved in housing. We've had, for example, one came through relatively recently talking about repair escrow and saving for future home repairs. We'll have our venture partners, Detroit venture partners, help us vet some of those ideas and opportunities. But with Rocket, I think that this is the best example, because a lot of times what we're seeing in Detroit is sort of a microcosm of what's happening across the country. And the way that Rocket is building its products to address those problems, we can help inform them, and they can help inform us. So we have, for example, been thinking with them about what would probate resources look like, or escrow planning resources as you're getting a mortgage? Can you make sure that your family is set up for an intergenerational wealth transfer? Nobody wants to think exactly about their parents dying or them dying, but the reality is we're all going to, and we want our families to be set up for success. The number of people that I have personally seen and talked to that are now in a really difficult situation because they and their family did not plan for that particular life event. It's a really serious conversation that we can help prevent proactively at the time of signing your mortgage. So I think that there's a number of ways that we can work together. Those are just a couple of examples of how we've supported Rocket to inform their products, and then vice versa, how they help us think through how can our work scale.
Love it.
So, Laura, we like to ask this question of our guest, which is, you're doing all this great work. I think you've given a ton of really strategic and practical answers to housers working on these challenges. If you weren't doing this, we have a lot of innovators, entrepreneurs, others that listen to this podcast. If you weren't working on this, what problem would you like to fall in love with? Or what would you recommend somebody listening to this look at? Because it would help your work if they solved that.
Well, I mean, we didn't get so deep into the home repair crisis in the city of Detroit, but I think that this is one that's really burgeoning for us. We launched a program a few years ago that allowed for home repair grants. Within the first week, we got 250,000 phone calls, which absolutely blew my mind. And it really indicated to me that the resources that we have are not nearly capable of addressing the need that exists in our market alone, but across the Midwest for sure. I would love to see people be more thoughtful as we are talking about housing supply around the role of existing housing and how can we better outfit existing housing stock to be a part of the solution in the long run. And then also, as we're building new housing, how do we make sure that that new housing that we're building is really well set up to weather the storm, quite literally, in the future, so that we don't get ourselves back into a hole like we have today?
Yeah, John and I will sometimes use Akron, Ohio as the example of a place that has enough houses if we could make them the house that a first-time home buyer wants, right? So that's just one example we use on Housing Insiders from time to time, but you're exactly right. We need that focus on fixing up the houses because they're there in some of our cities, and then building new ones in those and other cities. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's such a tough challenge. I'm glad you raised it. I mean, I think all the time about, a lot of people do renovations, but even the renovation industry is it's just a tough one. I mean, renovations tend to go over budget. The sort of work is inconsistent. The labor force is inconsistent, and it's hard to that's an even like very profitable type of business, and that's not even working. But then you think about like going into homes and making them more livable, or like in Detroit, a big problem with like lead paint, right? Just going in and remediating lead paint issues. It's just we don't have the resources and staff. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Laura, I know you are extremely busy. You have so many things that you are juggling constantly, and I'm always impressed with what you're working on. I just wanted to say a huge thank you for joining us today. It's been a great conversation, and I don't want to take any more of your time because I want you to go back to doing the awesome stuff that you're working on. So thank you so much. Great for having you on.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I will keep listening with lots of enthusiasm.
All right, that'll do it for today's episode. Thanks everyone who's listened in today. As always, we love to hear from you. If you have ideas for guests, want to sponsor, if you have questions on the episode, if you want to say how awesome Laura is, please reach out at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com.
We know you've already subscribed, so share Laura's episode, reach out to us with other guests, and thank you as always to Keenan Chen for the music.